We're in the middle of one of those passages which exemplifies a certain tension between traditional yoga and the yoga of self-enquiry. One of the areas of confusion is that the language in describing both is very similar, which isn't surprising given that self-enquiry arose within the context of traditional yoga. But it's really quite a separate thing, and we should be clear about that. The Yoga Vasishta itself is very clear about this, but only at times. At times the traditional voice, the voice of traditional yoga, seems to assert itself. And this is what's happening now. Total dedication to one thing, restraint of prana, and the cessation of the mind. If one of these three is perfected, one attains a supreme state. Total dedication to one thing is one-pointed concentration. This is a yogic meditative practice. That dedication, that focus might be on the image of a deity, or it might be on something physical, it might be on a geometric diagram or some other kind of device. Restraint of prana, this is the pranayama practices, and the cessation of the mind. From the point of view of self-enquiry, we're not interested in the cessation of the mind. To try and stop the mind is a misunderstanding from the point of view of self-enquiry. What we're interested in is stopping identification with notions that arise within the mind. The mind believes in its own stories. This is what we become aware of, and by becoming aware of it, the identification lessens. And it says one attains a supreme state. Well, the supreme state in yoga is mapped out as higher states of consciousness. You can get into some very refined states of consciousness, states of extreme quiescence. And again, this is not the interest of self-enquiry. Self-enquiry is directed towards consciousness, simple consciousness. That's the absolute. There can be nothing beyond that. So, from the point of view of self-enquiry, consciousness is the supreme state, but we wouldn't even describe it as such. The life force and the mind are closely related, like a flower and its fragrance, or sesame seed and oil. The basic understanding of the mind is valid here, though. The life force is what propels the mind on from one moment to the next. We don't need to understand it in terms of anything mystical or some sort of unseen psychic influence. It's essentially our tone, our inner sense of how we relate to existence. And this is what leads us on from one moment to the next. Hence, if the movement of thought in the mind ceases, the movement of prana ceases too. So from the point of view of the yoga of self-enquiry, the movement of thought is the movement of the attention. The attention is being hijacked from one place to the other. It's like dogs. If you look at dogs, they're totally out there, going from one thing to the next. Their attention is never turned back on itself. So it's by turning back on itself that we rein the attention in. This is the movement of thought. And the movement of prana ceases too. Well, this is the life force. We're no longer being driven by the life force, by this force which takes us from one moment to the next, which is really the sum total of our psychological tendencies. If the mind is one-pointedly devoted to a single truth, or it could be any object, the movement of mind and therefore of life force ceases. Now the mind can become very still through yogic practice, but this is not going to stop the latent tendencies from kicking in again at some point. So this is only a temporary phenomenon. Unless the mind is one-pointedly devoted to the single truth of its own nature, in other words, unless it actually turns back on itself, the life force is not going to cease. The yogi is no different from how I described the nature of a dog there. And I don't mean to be derogatory here about it, but the attention is still focused on something. As long as the attention is focused on something, you've only temporarily reined it in. And this might be useful for some mental training, but there's absolutely no spiritual understanding here. The attention has to turn back on itself for realization. The best method, and here we have it, the best method is by inquiring into the nature of the self, which is infinite. And this is it. This is when the tradition of yoga coalesces into the yoga of self-enquiry, when the attention is turned towards itself. This is self-enquiry. Your mind will be completely absorbed. Then both the mind and the inquiry will cease. Remain firmly established in what remains after that. And this is what the Yoga Vasishta does. It takes us from a traditional or cliched understanding and then brings us right back to self-enquiry, to realization of the self. When the mind does not crave for pleasure, it is absorbed into the self along with the life force, which we can understand here as our latent tendencies. Ignorance is non-existence. Self-knowledge is the supreme state. When your attention is focused on other things, you're on automatic. You're not really alive. You haven't made the most of your opportunity. Mind alone is ignorance when it appears to be a reality. That's when we identify with all our notions, when we actually believe our notions to be true. The realization of its non-existence is the supreme state. If the mind remains absorbed even for a quarter of an hour, it undergoes a complete change, for it tastes the supreme state of self-knowledge and will not abandon it. Quarter of an hour. I should try that sometime. Nay, even if the mind has tasted it for a second, well, that's more like it, it does not return to this worldly state. The very seeds of samsara, world appearance or cycle of birth and death, are fried. With them, ignorance is dispelled and the vasanas are utterly pacified. Vasanas are our psychological tendencies. One who has reached this is rooted in sattva, truth. He beholds the inner light and rests in supreme peace.